Well, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Jack Kim, the Associate Dean of Academics at the Army's Command and General Staff College. Today we have our next panel discussion that's sponsored by the Cultural and Area Studies Office, or CASO, of the Command and General Staff College, in conjunction with George Mason University, International Alert of London and the University of Kentucky, the Institute of World Politics in Boston University, and the Foreign Military Studies Office at Fort Leavenworth. The topic of the panel today is geopolitics and great power competition in the South Caucasus. CASO, jointly with its many partner organizations, continue the discussions of the most important topics in support of the U.S. national security and national defense strategy. These objectives go across the spectrum of conflict, including large-scale combat operations. Our session today includes 4 panel members. The first is Ambassador Richard Koslaric, a former senior deputy to the U.S. Secretary of State, the President's Special Representative to the newly independent states, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European Affairs. Ambassador Richard Koslaric is a distinguished visiting professor, George Mason University Schar School of Policy and Government. He teaches courses in the geopolitics of energy security and policy communications. Ambassador Koslaric was National Intelligence Officer for Europe on the National Intelligence Committee from September 2003 to April 2011, after a 32-year career in the Foreign Service. He served as United States Ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1997 to 1999 and to Azerbaijan in 1994 to 97. He was Senior Deputy to the Secretary of State's and the President's Special Representative to the newly independent states, or NIS, in 1993 and 94. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European Affairs in 1991 to 1993, responsible for relations with the former Soviet Union and economic ties with the European Union. Ambassador Koslaric also served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizational Affairs in 1984 to 1986 and as Deputy Director of the State Department's Defense Policy Planning Staff in 1986 to 1989. Ambassador Koslaric has served U.S. embassies in Ethiopia, Israel, and Togo. He received his AA from Black Hawk College, his BA from Valparaiso University, and MAs from Indiana University and the University of Michigan. Our second panelist is Ambassador Carrie Cavanaugh, a foreign U.S. Special Negotiator for Eurasian Conflicts and U.S. Co-Chair of the OSCE's Minsk Group. Ambassador Carrie Cavanaugh is Professor of Diplomacy at the University of Kentucky and Chairman of International Alert, a London-based peace-building organization. His foreign service career included diplomatic postings in Berlin, Moscow, Tbilisi, Rome, and Bern, and domestic assignments in the State Department, Pentagon, and on Capitol Hill. Under Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, Cavanaugh spearheaded or helped advance peace initiatives involving Armenia, Azerbaijan, Cyprus, Georgia, Greece, Moldova, Tajikistan, and Turkey. He was confirmed as Ambassador, Special Negotiator for Eurasian Conflicts, and U.S. Co-Chair of OSCE's Minsk Group. He led peace talks on Nagorno-Karabakh in Key West, Florida in 2001. Our third panelist is Mr. Paul Goble, who's a former Special Advisor to the Secretary of State, former Senior Advisor to the Director, Voice of America, and the Central Intelligence Agency. Mr. Goble is a longtime specialist on ethnic and religious questions in Eurasia. He served as Vice Dean for the Social Sciences and Humanities at Adventist University in Tallinn and as a Senior Research Associate at the Euro College of the University of Tartu in Estonia. While there, he launched the Window of Eurasia series. Mr. Goble served in various capacities in the U.S. State Department, the Central Intelligence Agency, and the International Broadcasting Bureau, as well as the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He writes frequently on ethnic and religious issues and has edited 5 volumes on ethnicities and religion in the former Soviet space. Trained at Miami University in Ohio and the University of Chicago, he has been decorated by the governments of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania for his work in promoting Baltic independence. He currently teaches a course in Islam and the Geopolitics of Eurasia at the Institute of World Politics at Boston University. And our fourth panelist Our fourth panelist, is Mr. Matthew Stein, who is a Eurasian security analyst at the Foreign Military Studies Office at Fort Leavenworth. Mr. Stein has published articles on regional border security issues, incidents of violence and civil unrest, and regional security cooperation. He was a Peace Corps volunteer in Turkmenistan from 2003 to 2005 and held a National Security Education Program, or NSEP, Boren Fellowship in Kazakhstan from 2008 to 2009. He has a master's degree in Russian and Eurasian Studies from the University of Kansas and is proficient in Russian and Kazakh. The bios of our panel members can also be accessed on the CASO website. Our moderator today is Dr. Mahir Ibrahimov, or Dr. I, the Director of the Cultural and Area Studies Office at the United States Army Command and General Staff College. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. I, who will continue moderating throughout this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for your support. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today for our quarterly session, which is actually has already become kind of routine. We do that every 2-3 months. So, next slide, please. This event is conducted following COVID-19 safety guidelines and is available via Facebook Live and VTC with limited presence of the audience here in Arnold. For safety of all of us, in the old pre-COVID situation, we would have full house of attendees here in Arnold, but we encourage everybody at this time to access Facebook Live link for safety of all of us. So the panel is conducted from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Central Time. The event is unclassified. The entire session is being video recorded. The opinions and discussion points during the session are those of the speakers and the moderator and do not necessarily represent official positions of the United States government. After the initial remarks, for about 10 minutes, our panelists will jointly answer your questions, reply to your comments. Next slide, please. Without further ado, I would like to yield the floor to Ambassador Richard Kauslerich, who will discuss the peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia and lessons from the Balkans for the South Caucasus. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours. Are you on? I can see the image, but there is no audio. Rich, can you unmute from your end?
I did, yes, thanks.
Okay.
Could I have the next slide, please?
Yeah.
What I'd like to do today in the time available is to draw on my experience from being the U.S. ambassador in Azerbaijan and the U.S. ambassador in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and try to see what is the experience that we've learned from both of those conflicts, which may help build a peace process in the South Caucasus. On the face of it, there may not seem to be many similarities for purposes of this discussion, but I believe there are two at least that we need to keep in mind. One, both the Dayton Agreement in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the ceasefire this past November were the consequence of an intense ethnic conflict that resulted in thousands of deaths. And there was a role for both regional and external powers, both in creating the conflicts in the first place, but also bringing about a peaceful solution. So what I want to try to do in my time here is to shift the focus from the war making that went on at the end of the last last year and talk about what steps I believe ought to be made to build the peace. And I think, that we have two choices before us as we move into the spring. Both sides, Armenia and Azerbaijan, I believe, are preparing again for war. And it's important for the international community to seize the opportunity that's before us in a relatively short period of time to start developing a negotiating framework that will lead to peace. Next slide, please. What I'd like to do is to just quickly highlight what happened in the Dayton Peace Accords and why the lessons from that are appropriate for the conflict we're talking about. Not because Dayton was such a rousing success in all that it was supposed to accomplish, but 25 years on, it's very clear that if nothing else, the Dayton process has prevented a resumption of war, and that's what we must be particularly interested in at this stage between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Carl Bildt, who was the Swedish foreign minister and the first high representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina, has just published a recent article that discussed what happened at Dayton both before and after. And one point he makes, and I underscore it for this discussion, is that the international community had to be involved in building the peace. That 25 years experience has very clearly indicated that no single country, or even two countries, could play the role of peacemaker. Now, three pieces that we really should bear in mind from that Dayton experience. First is, the archives at Leavenworth should be able to document this in great detail, but Dayton's military aspects required a substantial NATO-led international force of over 50,000 troops to be an effective peacekeeping operation. And the Dayton Agreement and its annexes covered the military aspects of this. The second part of Dayton, which was very important, was the civilian implementation. A high representative was designated to coordinate the agreement's civilian aspects, and this became critical in terms of the engagement between the warring parties. And then the third element that was important was something that took place after the Dayton peace process, and that was addressing the regional situation, region-wide in the Balkans, political, economic, and security challenges through a stability pact. So four really important points to keep in mind about Dayton. One very important element was war crimes and reconciliation. Even before the Dayton Agreement, the world recognized the extent of war crimes committed during the conflict. And the UN Security Council authorized an international war crimes tribunal because the warring parties were not going to address these issues. And in fact, cooperation with the war crimes tribunal was one of the four critical elements in the Dayton Agreement. The rights of refugees and displaced people. Annex 7 of Dayton created a commission for displaced persons and refugees. And it was really important to ensure the right to return home and regain lost property. But the peacekeeping operation was not enough to allow everyone to return to their homes. Some people decided they would prefer compensation for property loss rather than return. The third element here is the international monitoring. The Office of the High Representative, later supported by a Peace Implementation Council, was responsible for civilian implementation. And the important part, this involved not just nation states, the great powers and the regional powers, but also international organizations such as the UN and the OSCE. And then finally, and particularly important, was the interethnic boundaries. Well, while the Dayton Peace Agreement was about peace within Bosnia and Herzegovina, there were boundary lines that needed to be drawn between the different ethnic groups that resulted during the war. That was not easy. There was one part of Bosnia which was not addressed at Dayton, but placed under international supervision with the boundary to be determined by arbitration at a future date. It's an interesting story in itself, and perhaps for another episode. So let's next slide, please. What does this have to do with the Caucasus? Well, I think there's the possibility of what I call a Dayton light approach. Again, based on the same premise that was present for Dayton, that the international community must be involved. This is more than the Armenia and Azerbaijan can handle separately. It's actually more than Turkey, Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan can handle. I think the OSCE Minsk group should be the umbrella framework for addressing this issue, but it will need enhanced powers. But there must be a peacekeeping operation, monitoring mission that's far larger than the one that the Russians have put into place if you're going to guarantee the ceasefire, the right of return of refugees, and safe clearing of mines and unexploded ordnances. So let me just go over those 4 points that I talked about in Dayton and how they would apply in this case. There does need to be a war crimes and reconciliation process, whether you use the existing International Criminal Court or some specific UN Security Council established tribunal. There must be an outside independent mechanism for investigating, trying, and punish those committing war crimes, both before and after the ceasefire. But in addition to that, there needs to be what I call a peace and reconciliation mechanism that parallels the judicial process regarding war crimes to encourage people-to-people contacts, which are necessary if we're going to erase this enemy connotation of the other that both parties have developed. Refugee and IDP returns are absolutely critical for establishing a permanent peace. And this requires both Armenians and Azerbaijanis to have the right of return. Not everyone who would be eligible to return will be able to return. So as in Bosnia, there must be some sort of mechanism for either compensating claims or swapping property of equal value. But this process really has to be under some kind of international supervision, supervision of the OSCE or other UN organizations. There needs to be an international monitoring, some sort of special representative of the international community to help coordinate the military and civilian aspects of the international engagement, especially refugee return. Interethnic boundaries, the statement of November 9 that resulted in the ceasefire left a chunk of what I call Nagorno-Karabakh outside the control of Azerbaijan. And before there can be any peaceful settlement between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the boundary between the two countries has to be mutually and internationally recognized. So I would suggest that as Birchko under the Dayton process was subject to international administration until the parties could agree to what the boundary was, you need a similar mechanism here. An OSCE representative to supervise the right of return and if necessary, to ensure that the boundary is established, there should be a special arbitration panel to determine that boundary within a specific period of time, say a year, if the parties themselves can't agree to it. And finally, a permanent peace settlement between Armenia and Azerbaijan requires a region-wide approach to political and economic stability. And therefore, similarly to the Balkan Stability Pact, we need a stability pact for the South Caucasus to include Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia to function as an economic union and benefit from peace. And here, outside powers and organizations can play a positive role in providing the support for that regional integration that must take place. So with that, I'll turn it over to my good friends.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for the great presentation. Next slide, please. The next speaker is Ambassador Kerry Cavanaugh, who will tackle Nagorno-Karabakh diplomatic efforts. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today talking with you. What I want to focus on today is the diplomatic aspects of how the international community has tried to deal with Nagorno-Karabakh, to give you a sense of where we've come from, which gives a better picture of what's next and where we're likely to end up. I just have some graphic shots here to show a bit of the primitive nature of the fighting. I debated between this one with the happy soldiers or one showing them in trenches, but it's an interesting conflict, and maybe in the Q&A, if people want to talk about this, that literally brought World War I style war into the modern era with people in trenches trying to defend themselves from modern drone technology. And that didn't go very well for the Armenians. But this has been a long-term war that's roots go back very far. Next slide, please. I wanted to give you this picture too, because it all looks so peaceful from up here. Here you see both the North and the South Caucasus, and there's a couple important points that come out of this geography. One, these are serious mountains. I live in Kentucky. People in Kentucky say we have mountains. We don't have mountains. If you go to Colorado and you look at the Rockies, those are pretty serious mountains. These mountains can rival those mountains. And what these mountains did was create a reality for ethnicity, and Paul Goble may talk about this some later, where virtually every few valleys and every few miles you run into different ethnic groups. And what you would find in modern time in this region are hundreds of different nationalities, all broken into small components. And this becomes important for the development of the region, and it becomes important for finding solutions. It is not a place where all the French live on one side of the river, all the Germans on the others. Populations here were scattered. It's not simply a matter of 2 or 3 nationalities, it's many. We're looking at the South Caucasus today, but the North Caucasus, which you see in this picture, is important because that's in Russia, and that's packed with lots of national groups that Russia worries about wanting to become independent. So you see there a challenge too on the part of the reality of the ethnicity. I would add, if you see the lake in the middle of the slide, the mountain group to the bottom, just to the right of that, headed toward the Caspian Sea, is Nagorno-Karabakh. So fighting here is a very difficult thing, very mountainous terrain, easy to defend, hard to operate offensively in. Next slide, please. War broke out in this region before the collapse of the Soviet Union. It happened under Gorbachev. Glasnost started. There was a feeling that with Glasnost, the Russians would be able to maybe address the problems between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and fighting broke out and efforts were made to gain independence. Russia sent internal military forces. They failed to stop the problem. Before they could resolve it, the Soviet Union collapsed. Russia then later tried to tackle it as an international issue, also failed to be able to resolve it. So we find a situation, Russia can't solve it. The UN didn't want to deal with it. The UN was busy with other things, and at one point, in fact, the Department of Political Affairs in New York was spending half their budget sending people to watch and look at Nagorno-Karabakh. OSCE, CSCE, originally converting into OSCE, had just come online, European security institution, It's Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And they decided they would take responsibility, and the UN was delighted to hand it over to them. There was no other option here diplomatically that was readily available. Russia couldn't do it, NATO couldn't do it, UN didn't want it. A new institution took it on. It just so happened that Belarus had just joined OSCE. When they heard they were talking about peace for Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Belarusians said, oh, we know those guys, we'll offer our city to host it. That's how it got the name Minsk Group. The mission for this peace effort was peace and stability. Negotiating team was set up. Their aim was get a peace deal if you can, and if not, stabilize it. And it turned out they were naive thinking about peace and a bit naive thinking about stability. Next slide, please. What OSCE did was set up 5 different structures to deal with this fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh. Chairman in office is the head of OSCE, rotates every year. They realized that wasn't going to work, but the country that was in charge would then have a representative doing the mediation effort. At one point it was Italy, then Sweden, then Finland. That didn't work well because Russia really didn't take part in that mediation effort, was running a mediation effort of its own. But what it found, it couldn't solve the problem militarily as Soviet Union, couldn't solve the problem diplomatically as Russia. It did help establish a ceasefire in 1994. And in 94, Russia decides it'll work with OSCE and the Minsk Group to be part of this peace effort. And it becomes a co-chair process briefly with the rotating chair of OSCE in Russia, but very quickly that shifts, and in 96, 97 becomes a triple co-chairmanship of Russia, the United States, and France. And this is interesting in that they, in effect, bring major international power and authority to this process that people wouldn't have expected. There are other members of the Minsk Group. I've got them listed on this slide. Armenia and Azerbaijan are members, so the Minsk Group could vote against Armenia making a deal with Azerbaijan because Armenia or Azerbaijan didn't like it. Gets a little strange. And OSCE decided it would put a representative of the chairman in office in the region. That was set up, and they created a high-level planning group because their thought was, in a matter of weeks, we'll go to Minsk, we'll have a peace conference, we'll work up the peacekeepers, the kind Ambassador Kozlerich was just talking about, and we'll dust our hands off and we're all done. None of those things happened. What evolved was the co-chairs, Russia, the United States, and France, in effect became the mediators for the whole process with the other elements there, but not playing a central role. Next slide, please. And what the mediators did, Russia delivered a ceasefire. And in fact, Russia has delivered every ceasefire in this region because Russia has a preponderant military force in the region, and they're there. The United States, France, others don't want to get in there, don't have easy leverage to get a ceasefire. When things get really bad, Russia can. That brought the stability part. On terms of peace, the challenge, OSCE, is a consensus organization. So everybody has to agree on the deal. And the aim was the Minsk Group co-chairs would work with the parties, work with Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the people in Nagorno-Karabakh to find a compromise solution that was acceptable to everyone. And what they did in the ensuing 30 years was come up with a dozen plans. Some good, some not so good, none of them accepted. Some of them came very close. But each time they would present them to the parties, and some of them were developed by the parties themselves. They had not prepared their population to accept them. They were doing it because they were more in favor of something that looked peaceful that they were proposing, but they weren't happy with the terms, there was never a solution crafted that they would accept. Part of the challenge was the parties had absolutist positions. The Azerbaijanis wanted something that just focused on sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Armenians wanted something focused on ethnic self-determination, and OSCE and the UN both embody both of those principles in their charters. So there was not a visible compromise between the two that ever was satisfactory enough to get a solution. So while they've blamed the process for the problem, in most part, it's the parties. Diplomats take responsibility, that's fine. We couldn't do it, it wasn't your fault, but by and large, it's their fault. And where we're at today, the fighting that broke out in the fall, Russia made an effort to stop it with a ceasefire that failed in about a day and a half. After that, France made an effort that failed after about a day. The United States made an effort, all of their Minsk group responsibilities, that failed in about 2 hours. And when the fighting reached a point where I think Moscow was afraid if it continued, you would get open warfare that would draw in Russia and Turkey, Russia stopped it with a ceasefire arrangement under duress. But that ceasefire arrangement isn't a peace deal. And even that ceasefire arrangement codified the negotiations would continue in this Minsk group forum. So what we expect to see next is some restructuring perhaps, but a basic continuation of the Minsk group with Russia, France, and the United States working together. And our presentation today for the conference was titled Great Power Competition. And in this region, there has been, but in the Minsk group, surprisingly, it's actually been great power cooperation. By and large, Russia, France, and the United States have seen eye to eye through this whole process. And I think that's part of why, even when the new ceasefire was established in November and Putin's laying down the rules still include Russia, the United States, and France. And interestingly, the components of the ceasefire also include elements that could be found in these solutions that have been offered up by the Minsk group before. In fact, the only thing in the November agreement that hadn't been agreed to by all three in the Minsk group before was the imposition of Russian peacekeepers. We had an agreement before that peacekeepers would not include either Minsk group co-chair countries, representatives, or neighboring countries' representatives. Georgia got knocked out, that wasn't a concern, but knocking out Turkey mattered to Armenia, knocking out Iran mattered to several people, not least of whom the United States. So this is how we had a diplomatic process, how it brought us to today, and where it's likely to go toward in the future. But as Ambassador Kozler had said, you find in the elements of this dispute almost everything you found in the Arab-Israeli dispute, those types of issues of status, of Karabakh, territorial borders, exactly how corridors will work, reparations, compensation, none of those things have been resolved yet and will all have to be worked out in a formal peace deal. Last slide, please. What you see here is Russian peacekeepers on the Lachin corridor. The one thing worth pointing out here is Russia, I do not believe, really wanted to send them. It's not a safe place to have peacekeepers. Both sides fight. When there were ceasefires, they violated those ceasefires all the time. There was a general periodic death rate, fairly low, but death rate nonetheless. Ceasefire violations were almost a daily occurrence, and Russia now has placed about 2,000 soldiers in between these two groups. It's not a great place to be. I think they had to. That makes sense, but I think if they can find a way to not have them there long term, they certainly will try to take it. And let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for very interesting analysis. Next slide, please. Our next speaker is Mr. Paul Goble, who will provide his analysis based on his extensive expertise in the region. Mr. Goble, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with the two ambassadors and the other expert. As someone who has been watching the ethnic and religious groups of the South Caucasus now for almost 50 years, I want to add a perspective that is often missing in discussions of geopolitics. I think it's common ground here and more generally that the geopolitics of the South Caucasus has been upended by the Azerbaijani military advance last summer and fall, and that many of the assumptions that people had about what was possible and not possible are out the window. I think in the short term, there's a great deal of confusion about what can be done, and there's going to be a tendency to do more of the same rather than to see that there's a series of tectonic shifts taking place in the populations in the countries immediately involved. Those changes in the population below are going to affect not only the leaders of those countries because they are part of that population, but also because, as has been pointed out, the borders in this part of the world are far from perfect. There are people from each of these nations across the border in some other state, and that creates a set of expectations, fears, demands that no national elite can ignore. So what I'd like to do very quickly is to run through the way in which these geopolitical shifts that we tend to focus on the government chancelleries have affected the populations. Because below the governments in all 5 of the countries of the region, there have been fundamental changes that have happened that are going to drive much of what the political elites are going to be able to do. They cannot operate without an eye to these views because their country's stability depends on it, and the ability to make anything stick depends on it. If they get too far removed from where the population is, they will discover that the population will desert them. And it doesn't matter how dictatorial that government is. If they're deserted, they'll find out their ability to maintain stability and order in this region will be very limited. And those who are going to be interested in getting involved from the outside thus need to be aware not only of what the foreign minister, president, or prime minister has said most recently, but also how the populations view things. And right now, the way the populations view things are going to have a profound effect because they're so different from 6 months ago, that I think you're going to see a very new kind of geopolitics become possible. That doesn't mean that anyone is going to succeed. It does mean that a lot of things are going to be tried. And unless one understands where they come from, and that is they come from the population and its experiences and expectations, rather than from a decision made by a foreign minister or a president, we're likely to make a bunch of mistakes. So what I'd like to do, as I said, is to run through the 5 countries in the region, considering both the short-term and long-term geopolitical changes in psychology, if you will, and then talk about what that means for the Europeans and the Americans in terms of getting involved. Because I think one of the things that often happens is that just because institutions continue to exist, there's an assumption that they have the same content. In fact, the meaning of institutions may change dramatically. What a Minsk group was in 2000, what it was a year ago, and what it will be a year from now, I think are 3 very different things. And second, it is always possible that an institution may continue to exist because no one really wants to shut it down, but it may or may not have a fundamental role and may be being bypassed by other structures that are being created on the scene to deal with things. And I think that we need to consider some of those possibilities if we're going to be effective in getting involved in the geopolitics of the South Caucasus. So the 5 countries that I want, or 5 countries or nations, if you will, I'd like to talk about in terms of their reaction to the war and the way in which a partial settlement is proceeding are first Azerbaijan, second Armenia, third Russia, fourth Turkey, and fifth Iran. And Iran matters. We tend to write it off, but Iran matters a lot more than people think. Azerbaijan, as almost all the news stories had it, was the big winner. It recovered all of the buffer zone and a good hunk of what had been Karabakh. It was able to boost its influence in the region. It now has already had an impact on decisions in Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, showing that this victory matters more for Azerbaijan in another direction than is usually thought. It did get Moscow to come in with troops, and I agree that Moscow really didn't want the troops there because of the problems. I think, however, that Moscow put them in fearful that otherwise Azerbaijan was going to bring in Turkish troops, which it has a right to do under international law, and that would create a situation that was totally unacceptable for the Kremlin and for most Russians. That is, you would have the troops of a NATO country on the territory of the CIS, and that is something that represents a huge geopolitical defeat as far as many Russians are concerned. The most important thing that happened, however, in terms of the military action, I think there are 2 things that we need to remember. The first is Azerbaijan was clever enough to end the fighting and end its advance before it would have occupied the largely and more densely Armenian population areas in Karabakh. That would have presented problems for Azerbaijan, either if they behaved in ways that would lead to expulsions or mass deaths. And it was very clever to stop and get someone else to take responsibility for those. That was clever. Now Azerbaijan hasn't lost anything, and it doesn't have to assume some of the responsibilities it otherwise would. Much more important from Azerbaijani's point of view is the opening of a corridor between Azerbaijan proper and the Azerbaijani enclave Nakhichevan, which is separated by the Armenian territory, and which now will allow people from Azerbaijan and Nakhichevan to go back and forth without having to go through Iran and get an Iranian visa. That is no small thing for a lot of people. The war solidified Azerbaijan's relations with Turkey and certainly with Israel as well, and it has boosted the status of Baku. Unfortunately, it's had it from Baku's point of view, it's had another consequence in the population, and this is something that I think is as yet underrated. For 30 years, Azerbaijanis have thought of themselves, and indeed have been encouraged to think of themselves by their own government, as victims. In fact, now they are being told they are a victor people. When a population shifts from seeing itself as a victim to seeing itself as a victor, it makes different kinds of demands, not only on the foreign policy of the state involved, but also on the government itself. This was a challenge that Stalin faced after the Soviet victory in the East in World War II, and it's faced many leaders. I believe that what we are going to see is an Azerbaijani population far more engaged in terms of what goes on in Azerbaijan and what Azerbaijani foreign policy is like than anything we've seen before. That's something that isn't usually taken into account in making plans for agreements with Baku. The second country in my list, this very quick survey, is Armenia, which is clearly the big loser. It's lost a lot of territory, it's lost a lot of status, it's seen its control go away, it's seen much of its leverage on Azerbaijan disappear. It now sees Russians ruling what it thinks its people should be ruling, and this is a real problem. But the consequences of the war and its aftermath move in another direction as well. It is difficult to convey to anyone how betrayed the Armenian people feel by their own government, and more importantly by Moscow, which tried 3 times before it was able to get a ceasefire, which only by willing to put troops in did it get one. In fact, despite its promises to Armenia, despite Armenian assumptions that they would be taken care of, that was something they could count on. The sense of betrayal for a nation that has seen its area contract again and again over the last 700 or 800 years is so palpable that the fight within Armenia over Pashinyan and the question of what do we do next is probably less important than the fight about what do we do now that the last ally we thought we had is gone. A country that loses what it sees as an essential ally is a different place than one that thinks it still has one. The Russians are clearly going to try to suggest that they can play a positive role. But even now, the Russians are doing things, which I'll come back to briefly, I hope, that can't be pleasing to Armenia. Yesterday, Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, commented that there was no time now to talk about a final status for Karabakh. That would simply cause problems. Well, the whole issue, the whole Armenian agenda, its demands on a role for the OSCE Minsk group, is to talk about the status of Karabakh. If that's off the table, if the Russians are taking that off the table, then I promise you Armenians are going to view Russia in a different way than they ever have before. They don't have good choices. However, what is clear is Armenians are now more open to exploring possibilities that would have seemed unthinkable if there are other countries clever enough to make offers that they might be able to accept. And I believe that's going to play a role. Third, Russia. When Russian troops were put in the Caucasus, it was the consensus opinion of Western news coverage and commentary that Russia had won a huge victory. It had put troops in a place that it had pulled its troops after 1991. It was on the march. Putin's efforts to create a USSR 2.0 were getting another injection of energy. That's not the way it looks to Russians now. They're aware that those troops were put there under duress. And now an increasing number of Russian commentaries, including 3 today, 3 in the last 24 hours, have said that Russia is the big loser of the Karabakh conflict because it has allowed a situation to emerge where there will be Turkish forces on CIS territory, where Russian weaponry didn't work very well, and where Russian influence had declined to the point that it was only in extremis able to get Baku and Yerevan to agree to a ceasefire. Moreover, there are increasing questions about how much money it is costing Moscow to put forces into Karabakh. There are many people who feel that that is just ridiculous to spend that kind of money. And while some people will say, some Russian commentators will say that all of this is worthwhile because in their view, this has allowed Moscow to steal a march on the West and sideline the Minsk group. The fact is that domestically, there is much less support and indeed a great deal more anger about the Russian troops in Karabakh and the meaning of Russian involvement in the South Caucasus than one could ever have imagined a year ago. The Russians are also concerned, and this is something you see from Russian officials as well as Russian commentators, that because Azerbaijan has demonstrated a way to end a frozen conflict, that has put paid to much of Russian strategy in the so-called near abroad, which has been about creating conflicts and then freezing them as a way of maintaining Russian influence. and that there are going to be other people who are going to look at what Baku has done, be it Moldova, Ukraine, or potentially in the future Kazakhstan, who will see the Azerbaijani solution as a way forward. And that in turn is leading to more Russian comments in the population, and there's some polling data on this, that we shouldn't be involved there anymore. So the idea that this was a great Russian victory has within 2 months become the notion that this was a great Russian defeat, and that there was no masterful Russian diplomacy, but rather there was extreme weakness. Fourth, Turkey. Obviously, Turkey has gained influence by backing Azerbaijan, although its relations with Azerbaijan are complicated because the leadership in Ankara can't quite decide whether its idea of pan-Turkism is a union of peoples or a union of states. Those are two radically different notions. Azerbaijan accepts the idea that pan-Turkism is a union of Turkic states. Apparently, Ankara believes that pan-Turkism should be a union of Turkic nations. That gets us into some real complicated area, which you can't go into now. Turkey has certainly gained an influence. Some of the things that are happening in Central Asia in the last 2 months would not have happened without Turkey's support of Azerbaijan, especially the agreement between Baku and Ashgabat about the exploitation of the seabed of the Caspian, southern Caspian. But not just that. I would think that perhaps the most important, the most symbolically important, is that Kazakhstan has now decided, and this decision was made about 6 weeks ago, to go forward with a hurry up the introduction of the Latin script in place of the Cyrillic-based alphabet they have been using since Soviet, going back to 1940. So Turkey is certainly gained influence, but the relationship between Turkey and Azerbaijan is going to be complicated. And one thing that's very interesting is that some Russian commentators are now suggesting that Armenia's best course of action is to seek to play on contradictions between Ankara and Baku. We'll see. The fifth and last player I want to mention is Iran, because it's usually left out altogether. Let me tell you why it's so important here, not just because it's territory that lies along the borders of both Azerbaijan and Armenia, and not just because the Araks River that flows there is important for hydroelectric power and for irrigation, but because it's a border, a political border that divides the Azerbaijani nation. There are at least 3 times as many ethnic Azerbaijanis south of the Araks River in Iran as there are in the Republic. And they are not identical. They are both Shia, but the Azeris of Iran have had a very different history in the last 150 years, and they are culturally distinct. However, they do feel a political loyalty. As long as Azerbaijan wasn't doing very well, there was no big problem for Tehran. But with Azerbaijani's advance in the fighting, many Azerbaijanis south of the Araks began to think of themselves as Azerbaijanis rather than Iranians, or at least as that being equally valuable, and are looking north. Iran, to counter this, has put a lot more troops in northern Iran to try to make sure it controls the situation. But equally importantly, it has launched a major diplomatic effort in the last 2 weeks, sending its foreign minister and other members of the government not only to the 3 capitals of the southern Caucasus, but to Moscow as well, in the hopes of creating a situation so that Azerbaijan's success will not end up becoming an Iranian failure. That's going to be the way Iran is going to be playing this. It's going to be worried about Azerbaijani advance, as well as trying to figure out a way to maintain leverage. Azerbaijan was always subject to leverage by Tehran in the past because the Iranians could turn on or turn off the visa window that allowed Azerbaijanis to move between Nakhchivan and Azerbaijan proper. So what does all this mean for the Europeans and the Americans? It seems to me that there are three things I would like to leave you with in my remarks. The first is Moscow is certainly going to keep the Minsk group. It's made very clear that it wants the Minsk group to be around. It uses the Minsk group for a variety of purposes, and that's just fine. It has also made it very clear that what the Minsk group is going to be allowed to do from Russia's perspective may not be as broad a diapason as many in the West believe. There's certainly, as I've already mentioned, going to be no discussion anytime soon of final status for Karabakh. And without that, there are going to be problems. The second point I would make is that Moscow, along with the four other capitals that I've mentioned, are all going to be pursuing their own bilateral and sub-multilateral, if you will, arrangements to try to find ways to keep this from exploding again. No one, quite frankly, wants this war to start again, because almost anything that happens will lead to more problems rather than fewer. But that doesn't mean in a situation like this that a war can't happen. And so it seems to me one needs to spend a great deal more time paying attention to conversations between Tbilisi and Baku, between Yerevan and Moscow, between Tehran and Moscow, or Tehran and Tbilisi, than we are doing. Because it's going to be at that level that a lot of the movement is going to take place. And the third point is this: the expectations of the countries involved have been changed by the war and its outcome. There is a great change in Baku. I believe the Azeri people are going to be presenting demands to their government that they have not presented in the past. And that's going to put a challenge on the Aliyev government that we will have to see how well it will cope with. But unless all of those things are taken into consideration, what may happen is the diplomats may come up with something, the government officials may come up with something, but it will not be sustainable and supportable, because it will lack the foundation in the population, which is driven by many ancient hatreds and concerns, but also profoundly affected by recent events. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goble, for very informative presentation. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. Before I yield the floor to Mr. Stein, just a quick note, as we usually do. There was a reference by one of the speakers made to CSCE in the past, to OSCE presently, because we have a lot of general purpose forces, not specialized. So just a quick note that CSCE stood for Conference for Security and Cooperation Europe. Now it became organization. Some time ago, it became Organization for Security and Cooperation Europe. It wasn't just, as far as I know, and the distinguished panel will correct me, it's not just the name change. There were some changes in the documents of OSCE as a result. So with that, at this time, Mr. Matthew Stein will focus on the analysis of the processes in the region since the military operations between Azerbaijan and Armenia in 2016, it's reference to the April events, right, until the recent events. Mr. Stein, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ibrahimov. I will try to cover some areas that the other great panelists have already, I'll try not to cover some of the same things that they've done. I would just like to reiterate that it's worth repeating how the 2020 war really does mark a significant turn in the history of this conflict. While the scale and the speed of it may have surprised some people, there were things in place that happened in the years before September 2020 that give us some insight into how and why they took place the way they did. If you go to the next slide, please. So I've got here a 1928 Soviet map, and the yellow kind of oddly shaped section in the middle here is Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast. I'm starting off with this not to make a claim for one side or the other, to whose territory it is. I'm not trying to wade into that. I'm trying to show how, from a a regional perspective, how far back this conflict dates. I've tried to capture their perspective when I'm looking at the sources, what I do with my job at the Foreign Military Studies Office. Now, having said that I look at their sources, there's a fair amount of propaganda, there's a fair amount of disinformation from all sides, but there's still enough good information coming from in and around the region to provide a look at what happened over the last few years. So Ambassador Kavanaugh said it, that when Russia's being put into this, there's a number of incidents that take place along the line of contact. And we're talking about that line, the front line between Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh. And so there's any number of incidents that have taken place from 1994 up until the September 2020. But I'm going to dig in specifically into a series of clashes that took place in April of 2016. You can go to the next slide, please. So from the 2nd to the 5th of April, what stood out was the largest clashes to take place since the 1994 war ended. Now, this may have started off as an incident on the line of contact, but we saw Azerbaijan carry out artillery and rocket strikes, and they followed this up with assault from ground forces. There were reports pretty quickly that within the first day or two that they actually captured pockets of territory. Now, keep in mind that the map I have here is not official. It's just come from Wikipedia, but if you looked at reports that came out while the conflict was taking place and in the days after, this does match up pretty close to what happened. That in the north and in the east and the southeast of Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijani forces did capture a small amount of territory. Now, the Armenians were able to push back a little bit in the north around Talish, but that was the limit as far as Azerbaijan was able to take. Now, when I talked a little bit about some of the propaganda and disinformation, it took several days, but you saw the Armenian and Nagorno-Karabakh governments admit that they lost territory. That's a big kind of step that it marked the first time that territories changed hands since 1994. It's important to keep in mind that Nagorno-Karabakh has their own armed forces, and they also have Armenian armed forces there, but the Armenians are there unofficially. And the Armenian government can also tap into some reserves and other units and other weapons that they can deploy to the region as well. And we've seen that happen in 2020. So Azerbaijan pointed to this as a victory. We've already heard it a little bit too, that they've been spending on their armed forces, they've been developing their armed forces. They suffered a fair amount of losses. They suffered a fair amount of casualties that they didn't admit to until several weeks after the fact for just a small amount of territory. And this was kind of a sticking point to Armenia to say, well, yes, we lost the territory, but we were able to inflict a lot of damage on our enemy for it. So, trying to get through it real quick. The reactions, though, to the April 2016 clashes really also shed some light on what would happen, several years later. That this really served as a measurement for Armenia in particular to see what they need to do to avoid another outcome like this. We saw them talk about reforms in their armed forces, even carrying out a preemptive strike if they need to. The term offensive strategy was thrown around by the defense minister a number of times. You saw them purchase Sukhoi 30 multi-role fighters. They purchased some upgrades to their air defense systems, among a few other things. Even maybe most importantly, we saw Armenian forces in Nagorno-Karabakh, and then with even, I guess, coordinated with Armenia proper, carry out a series of annual exercises where they rehearsed a situation similar to April 2016. They believe that within the exercise scenario, they've got to throw everything that they have at this. They've got to declare martial law. They've got to mobilize all their reserves. And they did this a handful of times, even up to before September of 2020. And now on the flip side of this, you saw Azerbaijan do a similar thing, that they would carry out large-scale exercises. They actually even carried out a couple with the armed forces of Turkey. And we even saw them carry out an exercise while the rest of the country in May of 2020 and in Baku and across the country was in a pretty strict lockdown phase of the pandemic. Azerbaijani armed forces were out there carrying out an exercise with over 10,000 soldiers. Now, another significant mark that we saw with April 2016 was the use of UAVs. We saw this again, not just during the conflict, but you saw a lot more happen along the line of contact immediately afterwards. That Azerbaijan was using more of the kamikaze drones that they'd purchased from Israel. You saw the Armenian government in response to this basically say that they need to develop their own, and they also need to acquire better ones. Next slide, please. So the lessons learned from April 2016, I guess, seem to kind of play out again. That starting on September 27th, we see the Azerbaijani armed forces carry out a series of strikes all along the line of contact. Now, there were reports that all of their offense stalled in the north. We've heard about the mountainous terrain. That's where it stalled out at. They were able to punch through in some places in the south. Some differences, though, too, from 2016 and then even in the incidents that take place along the line of contact from 2016 to 2020 was that you saw Turkish involvement. These are anecdotal reports, but Armenia claimed that Turkey had been using F-16s in support of Azerbaijani armed forces. We did confirm, however, that the Turkish government had facilitated mercenaries coming from Syria. The Armenian armed forces were actually able to capture a few on the ground. So as the clashes dragged on from days into weeks, we could see some of the Armenian units were able to hold out in certain areas, some pockets, but they really lost the terrain in the bottom. If you could see the kind of aqua teal color, that's really where they lost the most territory. And we heard as well just previously that Azerbaijan appeared to know what they were doing with, they can take a certain amount of territory that they know that they can handle afterwards, and they're happy to let somebody else do the heavy lifting when it's all said and done. As the fighting also continued, you saw some long-range artillery and missile strikes by both sides. You even saw the city of Ganja in Azerbaijan hit by an Armenian missile strike. So by the end of October, kind of into early November, the Armenian government had been painting a picture of victory, even if they're acknowledging the casualties and losses on this. And this actually became a sticking point of a public backlash against the Armenian government, as far as I could see, that you told us things were going well, and now we're seeing the Battle of Shusha, where the city of Shusha is about to fall. What's going on? And then even a few days after that, the peace agreement announced on November 9th, there was quite a bit of backlash against the Armenian government for what happened. Why did this happen? So overall, it's like they said, this is not really a peace agreement, it's more of a ceasefire. And so the armed forces of both sides have been gearing up and developing for a conflict against the other, and now they've done it. So really where the research that I'm still looking at actually too is where do they go from here? Now that Russian forces are in place, you've seen a couple of incidents along the line of contact take place. But if something escalates into larger, it's still difficult to see how it might stop. And with that, I'll yield the floor back until I have some other comments too, but I'll...
Thank you, Mr. Stein, for very insightful information. Next slide, please. Before we move to questions and answers session, which is usually the most fascinating and engaging stage of our panels, I would like to summarize the main lessons which we learned from this conflict. As a moderator, again, I will just make the points without elaborating, just staying completely unbiased. Next slide, please. So, first, let's make it clear that the trilateral peace deal is not a full-fledged legal agreement. I think the speakers clearly indicated that. Rather, a statement of intent from legal authority and mandate perspective. That's why the security situation will likely remain fragile in the wider South Caucasus, which has been mostly neglected by the West. Second, we should convey a clear message to Russia as well as Iran, that they do not have a unilateral mandate in violation of the international law. Third, and of course this could build the framework of the OSCE Minsk Group. Third, the United States, jointly with its European and regional allies, need to act with one voice in the South Caucasus. Fourth, Mr. Goble rightly mentioned about the Iranian role. Concerning the Iranian role in new emerging geopolitical landscape, some discussions among the regional players suggest that there is a realistic chance of Iran being incorporated into the Trans-Anatolian gas pipeline, TANAP. However, because of the intense pressure by the US and its regional allies in the Middle East, Tehran will likely continue making the Middle East a priority for allocation of its power projections and capabilities. Nevertheless, this trend could change depending on the policies of the new US administration. As the Department of Defense, military aspects of lessons learned from the recent Azerbaijani-Armenian war would be of an immediate interest to us and our missions. As U.S. Army Chief of Staff General McConville said, quote, "The conflict does highlight a priority in developing air defense systems to defeat drones. When we take a look at future warfare, we believe that will be contested in every single domain. We are certainly going to be challenged on the land," end of quote. Unlike in prior conflicts, aerial capabilities are no longer exclusive to large powers and can be employed to enormous effect by any military, regardless of size and funding. This conflict clearly showed that. Baku was provided with Israeli loitering munitions, such as the Harop, IAI Harop, also known as suicide or kamikaze drones, and Turkish Bayraktar TB2 reconnaissance drones. Is just examples. The new generation warfare is likely to be more relegated to standoff engagements rather than troop-on-troop kinetic fights. Just to make a kind of to provide a clear idea, it's mostly been dominant through the previous wars, right? Force-to-force, kinetic fights like World War I, World War II, and other conflicts. So this conflict showed something new. Next slide, please. This is the map of TANAP natural gas pipeline, which originates in Baku, Azerbaijan, from the field, natural gas field, which is called Shahdeniz. From Azeri, it stands for King Sea. It's a huge, giant natural gas field. So then it goes as an expansion of South Caucasus projects right here. You can see the different legends by colors. Then the expansion goes further through Trans-Anatolian pipeline, that's what's called TANAP. And then extension continues until through the Trans-Adriatic pipeline, taking natural gas to Europe, specifically, for example, to Greece, Albania, and Italy. So, just to reiterate, is going from Azerbaijan through Georgian territory, Turkish territory, and to Europe. We discussed before during our previous sessions that when the major pipelines are built, they are really drastically changing regional and in many cases global geopolitical dynamics. So it's important. And they're affecting the geopolitics. It's not just the pipeline. So, next slide, please. These are Israeli and Turkish unmanned aerial systems I was referring earlier, which proved to be very effective during the Second Karabakh War. They are not, these capabilities, two capabilities, are not the same. Their roles kind of, their effectiveness are kind of different. For example, the reference was, I believe there was a reference to Russian Pantsir air defense systems, right? Some commentators and media said that they didn't prove to be effective against those capabilities in Nagorno-Karabakh, which Armenians used, right? But other analysts say that, they prove effective Pantsirs in different environments, such as the Middle East, Libya and Syria. So it's difficult to say why Pantsirs were not very effective against these capabilities. So the Pantsirs, again, this is the Russian air defense systems for the reference, right? So next slide, please. So now the questions, answers, and comments session. Please introduce yourselves, ask a question, make a comment. So we've got a number of questions to share with our panel as well. Do we have any questions from Facebook Live at this point? Okay. So the first question is from Mr. Keith Barclay. Do you see China getting more involved with this conflict? So this is the question from our outstations across the nation and beyond, and directed towards our distinguished panel. Who would like to answer this question, please?
I'll take a chance at that.
Yes,
because
Mr.
I can
Goble.
speak. The Armenian authorities and some of the Armenian academic experts are pressing very hard for the idea that China is the best option Armenia now has to find a new protector. The Chinese have been interested in moving in that direction. Chinese involvement has been much larger on the eastern side of the Caspian than the western side. It involves investment, corruption, and absorption of large segments. In Armenia, there is a hope that Chinese investment could allow Armenia to have some economic growth it hasn't had much of, and begin to build up infrastructure, which increasingly has been in the hands of the Russians. The Russians, for example, control the entire rail system. So yes, the Chinese are getting more involved. They're getting involved in Armenia at the request of the Armenians. In Azerbaijan, less so. The Iranians are also quite involved in terms of developing rail links with China through Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you, Mr. Goble. Any other speakers would like to add?
I would just add on
Yes,
the
Mr.
Azerbaijani side, they've invested a lot of rhetoric, at least, in promoting the idea of a Belt and Road Initiative route that would come overland across the Caspian from Kazakhstan and then on to Turkey and beyond to Europe. And the famous Baku-Tbilisi Kars Railroad project is kind of part of that. I tend to think that's overblown because there just simply isn't enough trade that's going on from China that would go across the Caspian and beyond. But the Chinese have made a major push to become more involved in energy development, as Paul pointed out, more on Central Asia side than on this side. But China is a factor, and I think they would want to measure the economic benefits of overly investing in Armenia versus Azerbaijan and Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Ambassador Kavanaugh, is there anything you would like to add? Mr. Stein?
No, I don't have anything.
Okay. If I am allowed, I would like to add, as a moderator, I guess I am allowed to add to this particular question. Ambassador Kavanaugh, did you want to say something? No?
No,
I'm
I
sorry.
just realized I was muted,
Okay.
so I'm unmuted.
So some of us who are closely following the situation in the region and global, of course, We know that China have been declaring their non-interference policy, at least the official statements, in the South Caucasus, right? But of course, but let's look at the statistics. According to the World Bank statistics, since 2013 alone, since the start of the Belt and Road initiatives, trade turnover has increased around 70% in Armenia, 100% in Azerbaijan, and 60% in Georgia. So I know as the U.S., we've been having challenges with China, mostly because China have been acting through the so-called soft power venues of influence. And that's what they're quietly doing. So I would suggest that we as the U.S. would be concerned about Chinese strategic approach to the South Caucasus, similar to other regions of the world. That's all I have. Over. Anything to add from the panel, distinguished panel?
Actually, let me bring up one point related to something you said. I think the discussion about the Belt and Road Initiative is genuine. China is putting money and investment potential there, and countries in the region will want to take advantage of that. One of the dilemmas with China's involvement, if it's greater, is in fact this war that just took place. The president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, has argued there is no conflict anymore. It was resolved, and it was resolved by military means, and that's acceptable and legitimate. We see China today in its territorial conflict with India and its territorial disputes in the South China Sea, also arguing that military force is an acceptable way to address these problems and solve them. It's clear on the part of the Europeans, both the Minsk Group co-chairs, Russia, France, United States, and regular European countries, we don't want this to be the model for how you solve disputes in Europe. It's very unhelpful. And in that sense, I think even if China gets involved economically, it'll find a very hard path to getting a political toehold where it's able to engage in peace process and some of these greater diplomatic efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Yes, Mr. Ambassador. Yes, Rich.
I'd like to kind of go back to the slide that you had about the pipeline going from Azerbaijan to Europe, basically.
Tanap?
And
Yes.
you know, as you and the other panelists have pointed out, the nature of war in the region has changed dramatically. I really think it bears further examination the changes in the international energy market and what has happened from the time this pipeline was planned and begun to be constructed until now. The demand for oil and gas from this region is just not what it was in the 1990s. If you look at just today, BP announced horrible financial results, and BP is the major international partner for Azerbaijan in the development of these oil and gas resources. And what I'm worried about is that Azerbaijan in particular sees itself as a kind of a geopolitical player because of energy relationships that were true in the 90s but aren't true today. We've seen Chevron and ExxonMobil essentially pull out of the Caspian region. It'll be very interesting what happens with BP if they pull out. Then I think your Chinese question becomes really relevant. Will China, commit to greater engagement in the energy sector as Western companies pull out, and the overall energy picture for which these pipelines and the products that they're carrying has changed radically in a negative direction for Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. So for those who don't know, BP stands for British Petroleum, and that was the actually probably number one member of the so-called international consortium since the early 90s. which was active participants, by the way, of another major pipeline, but this time it's oil pipeline, Baku-Ceyhan pipeline. And Mr. Ambassador Kozlarich, clearly remember when we were kind of in the beginning of that process, when really that pipeline became the so-called strategic pipeline, was important to kind of support the independence of Azerbaijan and other littoral countries, minus Iran, of course, of the former Soviet Union. But yes, the dynamic is changing, as Mr. Ambassador Kozlarich mentioned. So, and the relevance of China, particularly, could grow. I would agree with that. So, if there is anything else to that question from the distinguished panel? Okay, we have a question from this audience, and then we'll go back to the Facebook Live. Yes, sir, in the back. You introduce yourself and ask your question, please.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Major Andrew Lingenfelter, Staff Group 8 Bravo. You speak of the Russian defeat or the Russian diplomatic missteps during the negotiations. What does that mean in the overall context of their geopolitical position or the relationships with the United States going forward?
Distinguished panel, who would like to answer this question, please?
Well, since I was the one who made reference to defeats and missteps, I'll take a first whack at that.
Yes, Mr. Goble.
There's a tendency in the West to cherry pick whatever Moscow says and to focus on that. If you look only at the question of whether putting troops back in Azerbaijan constitutes a great achievement, then you think it's a great achievement because you've defined it as such. If you think about the relationships and the problems that Moscow has taken upon itself, if you think about the problems that it has with its own population, there's increasingly asking questions as to why the Russian government is spending so much money on its foreign policy adventures. One statistic last week is that the amount of money that Vladimir Putin has spent in the last 15 years on foreign policy adventures, and that was the term used in a Moscow newspaper, would have been enough to build 15,000 hospitals, which Russia desperately needed during the pandemic and didn't have. Most of the deaths that Russia has had from the pandemic have been because people could not even get to medical care, because most of the medical points outside of major cities have been closed down over the last decade to save money. I think that Mr. Putin is, as the Russians have the expression, "Hitrый не умный," clever but not very intelligent. He's clever in the short term, but he is not someone who thinks in very large ways about the meaning of what he does. And as a result, many of the things he does, which look very clever as a single move, may end up getting him in terrible trouble. And there are many people in Russia today, and not just those who are demonstrating for Mr. Navalny, who think that this is a man whose best days as a foreign policy strategist and tactician are behind him. I think that we have to face up to the fact that we have an aging foreign policy elite around Putin. The foreign minister is definitely aging, and these people will make mistakes. And I think we're going to see more problems in the future because of that.
Thank you, Mr. Goble. Ambassador Kozlarich. Oh, yeah, okay. Ambassador Kozlarich, you first, and then we'll go to Ambassador Kavanaugh, please. Ambassador Kozlarich.
Well, going back to my time in Baku in the early 90s, I mean, Turkey and Russia were always the two most important outside powers at that time as well. And so, in a sense, nothing has really changed. And Kerry, I would appreciate your comments on this in terms of U.S.-Russian relations through thick and through thin throughout this period, and the Minsk Group being the most visible example of this. Rhetorically and maybe even at times in real terms, Russia always wanted to keep the Minsk group going, wanted to keep, a good relationship with France and the U.S. as we address this problem. Now, I agree that they don't want a peaceful solution to this to be the result. But on the other hand, they saw value in cooperating with the U.S. And I think we saw similar value in cooperating with them. But my sense is the Russian engagement here was less to put troops back on the ground in Azerbaijan in particular than to prevent things from really going bad if the war continued from their own interests, and then forcing them to confront the obligations that they had with Armenia in terms of mutual defense agreement, and at what point would that be triggered by, if you will, an overwhelming Azerbaijani advance on the battlefield. That's just my sense.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Anybody else from the panel?
Yeah.
Yes,
Let me say a couple remarks on missteps and a couple on U.S.-Russian cooperation here. Russia's had a problem from the beginning with the collapse of the Soviet Union in how it approaches the countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union. And I think a challenge that was particularly evident in the Caucasus was this sense of, we know them, they're kind of little brothers, we can control this, we can influence this. And they've found again and again that approach doesn't get them very far. Once these countries became independent, they became quite independent. And they didn't welcome the big brother from Moscow coming down saying what you could or couldn't do. I think Moscow's also always thought these things are going to be easier than they are. Easier to get ceasefires, easier to maintain influence, easier to exert control. Russia for a long time was the leading arms supplier to both sides. It had an alliance with Armenia. It gave them arms under that alliance arrangement, happily sold weapons to Baku for cold hard cash. They would joke and say, we can keep them balanced because we know what we're selling each one. 2016, when Azerbaijan grabbed those little parcels of land, at that point, Israel was Azerbaijan's leading arms supplier. Russia lost control of that. I think Russia thought legitimately, we can get ceasefires again. We always get the ceasefires. And as you heard, 3 times in the fall, they tried, 3 times they failed, only by coming in very heavy-handedly and having to put in forces were they able to do that. So there's been a continuous underestimation of the country's independence, overestimation of your ability. On the part of U.S.-Russian cooperation, what Ambassador Kessler had said, and I had mentioned earlier, is true. This was an area where there was virtually no daylight between the United States, Russia, and France. And even when we were fighting on all fronts across the planet on different issues, or actually fighting in places like Syria, at least our troops coming up right next to one another, we could cooperate here. Part of the challenge Russia had dealing with us here is our overall poor relationship with Russia spilled over here, not on the policy side. We didn't have a different policy approach, but on the engagement side. At one point, as you heard, oil and gas in this region just became less interesting to the United States. You see our interest diminish, our involvement diminish. At another point, under President Obama just gets tired of dealing with Russia. We do less work with them in this area, and that gets exacerbated even more under President Trump, where it's hard to identify a coherent U.S.-Russia policy at all. We downgraded our representative to the Minsk group, so it became a Russian ambassador, a French ambassador, and a regular American diplomat. And you did not get the attention at higher levels that you had gotten before on this question in either the United States or France. I had mentioned Key West, and it was on one of my slides. In the run-up to Key West, there were direct communications between President Putin and President Bush, both of them with President Chirac. All three presidents got involved tangentially in peace efforts. Colin Powell opened the peace talks in Key West. This is a very high-level engagement, and Russia hasn't had that to balance for almost 10 years now. So it's become a real challenge for Russia, and even where you agree on the U.S. positions, and that's solid, how do you get involved in the issue directly with the United States when the United States wasn't dealing firmly with Russia? That may change under President Biden, but I think we've only seen one phone call, but at least we got a readout, and we should watch that space.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Anybody else? Rich? Yes, Mr. Kozlerich. Ambassador Kozlerich.
Yeah, maybe there'll be a question on this, but there might be a segue here to talk about Turkey and Turkey's role. Because I think there in some of the media there's the assumption that Turkey is a big winner in all of this as well, and I think we need to examine that relationship with Azerbaijan a little more carefully. I don't think it's necessarily in Azerbaijan's interest for there to be a permanent Turkish military presence in Azerbaijan. I'm sure there are people in Azerbaijan who believe that somehow that will protect them against the Russians or give them an advantage with Armenia. I'm not entirely sure. I think back to my time in Baku when there was a Turkish government that mounted a coup against Heydar Aliyev. Much to their chagrin, it didn't work. But the Turkey-Azeri relationship is not just a question of two states, one nation. I mean, it's a very fraught relationship in a number of respects. And so I think that Turkey dimension to all of this is going to be a complicating factor rather than a positive factor for Azerbaijan in particular.
Could I add a footnote to that?
Yes, Mr. Goble, please.
This tension between Turkey and Azerbaijan was very much on evidence in what President Aliyev designated Victory Day parade. President Erdogan, who was there, made reference to a expansive pan-Turkism of the nations rather than of the countries. By reciting a poem more precisely, that suggested that the northern third of Iran really ought to be part of this wrap-up. That is not Azerbaijan's position. A greater Azerbaijan that included southern Azerbaijan would be a huge problem for Baku. And there's another problem too, which is certainly going to surface, and that's this. 100 years ago, it was the Azerbaijani national movement in Baku that was making the moves that ultimately spread back to Turkey rather than the other way around. The Azeris have never forgotten that, and neither have the Turks. And just in case the Turks do forget, the Azerbaijanis are quite happy to remind that many of the firsts in the Turkic world and in the Muslim world happened in Baku, not in Istanbul or Ankara. And that makes the relationship more fraught than would otherwise be the case as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goble.
Yes. And the poem would go back to the days of Elchibey when he was president of Azerbaijan, and he used to use that vocabulary as well about.
But the Aliyevs don't.
No, that's exactly right.
Yes.
Thank you so much, distinguished panel. If I may, just real. Yes, Kerry, please. Ambassador
So
Kevin,
Turkey's
please.
had positions in this region at different points. That at one point they fully backed the Minsk group, for instance, and we're helping work toward a solution. What we saw last year is fully against the Minsk group, and or we're challenging whether it should be able to continue to exist at all. I think where Erdogan sees himself as winning isn't just the Azerbaijan angle, but in portraying a Turkey that supports Muslims everywhere. So this effort, his effort in Syria, his effort in Libya, all produce a public relations package externally that I think he feels helps him, but also, as Paul Goble pointed out, also has a significant cost at home where you have a Turkish economy that's not doing all that well today. The other area where Turkey actually stood out is in its weaponry. Turkish drone sales are probably going to jump. They proved very effective in this battle, but at the same time, it's raised some other concerns on Turkey. There's a general thought that it may not have been Azerbaijanis piloting the drones. These Bayraktar 2s had just been recently acquired by Azerbaijan. It's very hard to know who's flying it. They were flown with incredible skill, and Azerbaijan in this fighting was doing multi-drone sequencing for how they would plan attacks and conduct attacks, literally to the point they would have a reconnaissance drone, an attack drone, and a third drone filming it all so they could study it for improvements in their tactics later. So Turkey will have jumped up on that, but it may well have created a NATO problem. Canada at one point sought to stop certain arms sales to Turkey, particularly the cameras that are used in those drones, and ran into a problem. There's a Canadian law that provides you can't restrict arms sales to NATO partners. But it may raise some questions in Brussels about what do you do with Turkey and NATO? And that's exacerbated by Erdogan's heavy hand in the Eastern Aegean last year as well, which has created an ongoing battle between him and President Macron of France.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Anybody else from the panel? Okay, just a quick note, if I may. If we're talking about the same poem, which I believe I am very well aware of, which Erdogan was reciting, it goes back to the root of this conflict, essentially, when the Russian Empire started to expand in the 18th century. As a result, that ended up with these 9-10 million of Azeris in the former Soviet Azerbaijan and between 20 and 30 million in Iran. So after that, after this poem, I believe even the Turkish ambassador in Tehran was convened to by the Iranian foreign ministry, which caused a lot of concern by the foreign ministry. But I believe behind the scenes they settled this little incident. So, I believe we are referring to the same poem, right? Over. So it caused a huge concern, kind of immediate concern from the Iranian authorities. So if no other comments or answers from the distinguished panel, we'll go to the next question, this time from the Facebook Live, from Dr. Jack Kam of CGSC. His question is, Azerbaijan launched a rather impressive IO information operations campaign at the onset of the conflict, including the heavy metal song Ateş. It's pronounced Ateş. Just to make sure that, the question is, how effective was this effort? Ateş from Azeri stands for fire, compared to not like a fire, like it would be different word, ot in Azeri. But Ateş stands for like you firing your weapon, fire. So I don't know if the panel is aware with this particular information campaign or general, of course, I'm sure you are aware. So what will be your answer to that question? Over? Anybody from the panel?
So I will make a comment on that. Both sides actually waged a fairly significant information campaign. Azerbaijan's came out more on top One, because they won, so they had a lot more victory footage to show. But two, and it may go back to the Eurosong competition, but they seem to catch the Western vibe of how to make videos the right way. So all of a sudden, very effective tie-ins of military footage, particularly drone strikes, and heavy metal music or rock music. Some very specific instances where you could tell they were putting soldiers in the field deliberately to film them. So they would reenact villages they had taken, all making them look more effective, more powerful than they were. In the end, however, of course, they won. They won on the ground and they won on the info part because they were more effective and more powerful. But I think that was part of the challenge that Paul Goble referred to that caused such troubles in Armenia, because Armenians watching social media thought they were winning. They thought they were doing fine. And in fact, the countering of Azerbaijani propaganda led to a back blow in Armenia, where the population did not realize how poorly they were doing on the ground.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Ambassador Kazlovich, please.
Yeah, I just sort of comment on the Azerbaijani diaspora here in the U.S. I think the impact of the, if you want to call it the successful propaganda campaign from Baku, was really dramatic on the opposition forces, who up to this point had been hypercritical of almost any move Aliyev would take. All of a sudden, they're as nationalist, if not more so, than the authorities back in Baku, and that criticism essentially evaporated. But one thing that struck me that I'm really concerned about was the overwhelming impact, and the propaganda effort sort of centered around this, where the images, the drone images of the attacks on Armenian forces, and the dehumanizing effect that would have on people looking at this for whom the war was now a video game. And I think everyone has kind of lost sight of the fact that there were upwards of 5,000-6,000 soldiers on both sides who died in this war. The human cost, I don't think, is clearly sunk in yet because of the way the war was portrayed while it was going on.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Goble, you wanted to say something to add?
No, I was just reconnecting. I had a power surge.
Mr. Goble, a lot of people refer to your plan. I mean, this is amazing, and we've known well about your plan, for many years. So that's all right. So anybody else from the panel to that question? If not, then we're going back to this audience. Dr. Wilcox, did you have a question, right? Mark, yes. Dr. Wilcox, please identify yourself, ask your question.
Thank you. Mark Wilcox here on the faculty to Command General Staff College. All panelists, thank you very much for your comments. Ambassador Kavanaugh, especially nice to have you back here. It was a while ago when you were on our interagency panel, but it's nice to see you at least virtually. My question gets to a point that Ambassador Kazlarich had made, and I really appreciated his analysis, pulling together lessons from the Balkans and the South Caucasus, having dabbled in both issues myself. I noted that in your description of Dayton and talking about a possible Dayton Light for the South Caucasus, one portion of the Dayton Accords that you didn't mention was Annex 1 Bravo, which are the 3 agreements on regional arms control, sub-regional arms control, and regional stabilization. I was wondering if in your Dayton-like program that you might see for the South Caucasus, is there a place for some kind of sub-regional arms control or perhaps confidence-building measures? Understanding that the states there are parties to the CFE treaty, at least on paper, and that they are part of the document. But do you see any room for some sort of sub-regional agreement on military security? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilcox. Who would like to answer that question from the panel? Yes, Ambassador Kozlaric, please.
Since I didn't raise that, I should address it. And just as a preface thing, I've been so unrealistic about what I've presented. I didn't even get into the area that you've just identified, which I happen to believe over time ought to be the path that the region follows. I mean, none of these countries, including Azerbaijan, can afford the expenditures for their respective militaries for the indefinite future. And I think if there is going to be something like a stability pact mechanism for the region, that ought to be part of it. But realistically, I just can't see anyone at this stage prepared to engage in that important step. I just don't see that happening right now.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Anybody else from the panel? Okay, we have a comment here. It's relates to the purely military capabilities. One of our stations just made a comment that Mirsad Alibegovich, our international student apparently, Panzer system showed a lot of vulnerabilities during the obviously Azerbaijan-Armenian war, right? That system is not effective as some countries think. It's just a comment. Unless, yes, Mr. Stein, please.
There's been a few reports that the Armenians, when they're looking at kind of an after action for this, that they said, well, the Armenians believe that they have the right air defense systems in place. They maybe need a few upgrades here and there. But the comment that I saw on a number of times was that they're not integrated enough. That was the issue, the lesson they feel like that they've learned, that they need to do better on, is integrating all their air defense systems. Not just responding piecemeal, but to have the better system in place, like a whole system, integrated system in place.
Thank you, Mr. Stein.
Can I add to that? The Azerbaijanis did a very interesting thing, and they took old Soviet-era crop dusters and turned them into drones. So they made them pilotless so they could fly them, and these were used in the first stage of the fighting. And the Armenians took them to be modern drones, revealed where their air defenses were to shoot them down, and promptly lost lots of their air defense very quickly due to other drones that were loitering above them, now seeing where their positions were. And I think the challenge for Armenia, part of it, was they've always viewed Azerbaijanis as inferior military actors. In Soviet days, Armenians could rise to be marshal of the Soviet Union. They would be in combat arms assignments. Azerbaijanis were in road construction details and didn't rise that high in the ranks. And that prejudice persisted up to modern time. And only with this fighting, and as we even talked about, this information campaign, did the Armenians realize to their horror that Azerbaijan had become much more sophisticated. We see it in the drone strikes. We see it in overriding their air defense systems. We also saw it in Shusha. The Armenians expected a large assault on the city of Shusha. It's a high ground beyond compare. It's literally a natural fortress. That large ground assault never came. The Azerbaijanis used special forces operating tactics, mirroring what we used in Afghanistan, to infiltrate their people up the mountain into the city, to where all of a sudden Armenians looked around, saw Azerbaijanis were already downtown and fled. So there really had been a change on the military side for Azerbaijan in training capability and tactics. But part of that is coming from their relationship with Turkey and their relationship with Israel, and some of their activities supporting the United States in other conflicts that we've been engaged in.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We're getting closer to the end of the session. If the panel doesn't have anything to add, Ambassador Kozlarich or Mr. Goble or Mr. Stein, we would like to wrap up the session, if that would be okay. And to the outstations, we see a lot of questions still coming in. Our suggestion would be to send your questions to Mr. Sals or myself. So this contact information was in the announcement to the internal and external audiences. And we'll be happy to forward those questions and comments to the distinguished panel. So distinguished panel, anything else before we wrap up the session, please?
Yeah, I would just like to say, and I'm probably speaking for Paul and Rich as well, how much we welcome this opportunity and how bad we feel that COVID-19 meant we didn't get to go to Fort Leavenworth this time. It is always great to be there and interact directly with our officers in training and the troops. And I hope next time we're able to make that journey.
Absolutely, Kerry. Absolutely, Ambassador Kavanaugh. Yes, Ambassador Kozlarich, you wanted to say something?
No, just agreeing with Kerry.
Very good. You know, I can assure you, in pre-COVID environment, this room would be completely full, and everybody can confirm that present in this room, particularly for this very knowledgeable panel. But we discouraged everybody for understandable reasons. We directed everybody to connect through the Facebook Live, and that's what we're getting a lot of questions and participation. So, next slide, please. So this final slide contains our contact information for any related questions for the outstations or internal audiences. These are the links to CASO website. The video and related information will be posted in about 1 week after the panel on CASO website, as well as CJC, Army University, and possibly CAC Facebooks for further educational purposes. As usual, the related articles are planned in Army.mil, LAMP, and other possible venues. On behalf of all of us, I would like to thank our panel for sharing their great and very insightful expertise with us. These conclude our session. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.